The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Arthur's Brew, painting the wooden floors in long golden streaks. The air was thick with the scent of freshly roasted espresso beans and cinnamon. It created a cocoon of warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. Soft jazz played from hidden speakers, something instrumental and unobtrusive. The kind of music that made studying easier rather than distracting from it. The café hummed with the quiet energy of productive people doing important things. Oak Creek was the kind of suburb where money was old. Lawns were maintained with near-obsessive precision, and problems were handled discreetly behind heavy oak doors and closed curtains. The town had a reputation, well-manicured, well-polished, well-guarded, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, but nobody talked about it publicly. In a worn leather booth near the back of the café sat 17-year-old Jamal Hayes. He was surrounded by the controlled chaos of serious studying. His AP US history textbook was open to a section on the Civil War's political complexities. Flashcards were scattered across the table in front of him, color-coded, hand-written, representing weeks of meticulous preparation. A half-empty mug of hot chocolate sat to his left, a crumpled receipt beside it showing he had purchased it roughly 30 minutes earlier. Jamal was a high school junior juggling an impossible load. Varsity track had competitions nearly every weekend. It demanded early morning practices and disciplined training. Advanced placement courses filled his weekday schedule. AP US History, AP Chemistry, AP English Literature. The Georgetown University scholarship he was chasing would require both excellence and dedication, the kind of performance that didn't happen by accident. It happened because teenagers like Jamal denied themselves sleep, social events, the casual freedom other kids took for granted. He wore simple clothes, a gray hoodie that had seen better days, faded jeans, worn-out sneakers that were more comfortable than fashionable. His appearance wasn't meant to impress anyone. It was functional, practical, the outfit of someone who had better things to think about than fashion. His hair was cut close and neat, maintained without fuss. What nobody looking at Jamal in that moment could have known was the weight he carried. It wasn't visible in his posture. He sat up straight, focused, his shoulders squared against the demands of his life. The weight was internal, the weight of being aware that his opportunities were conditional in ways other students were not. The weight of understanding, even at 17, that a mistake could cost him more than it would cost a white kid. That a moment of being in the wrong place could become a permanent mark. His mother had taught him these lessons early, not to instill fear, but to instill awareness. His mother was working a shift in the city, a demanding job that kept her occupied until evening. They had a plan. Jamal would study at the cafe. She would pick him up after work, and they would grab an early dinner together. It was one of their rituals, their way of maintaining connection despite her long hours and his overwhelming academic load. 3 miles away, Officer Bradley Miller was patrolling the commercial strip, the part of Oak Creek where the nice shops and restaurants catered to the town's wealthier residents. Miller was 34 years old, though his face had taken on a prematurely aged quality that came from years of chronic anger. He was thick-necked and broad-shouldered, the kind of man who had been athletic once and had allowed himself to thicken with the years. His uniform fit him like armor, and he wore it that way, as a tool of power rather than a symbol of service. Miller gripped the steering wheel of his cruiser with white knuckles. His mirrored sunglasses reflected the passing storefronts. His jaw was perpetually clenched, his mouth set in a permanent scowl that he had long ago convinced himself communicated authority. What it actually communicated was anger looking for a place to land. To Miller, the badge meant something different than it was supposed to mean. It wasn't a responsibility to protect and serve. It was a license, a piece of paper and metal that gave him permission to act on his worst impulses. It was a shield that would protect him from consequences, or so he had come to believe. The uniform was his armor, and the gun on his hip was his security blanket. In the passenger seat sat Officer Thomas Miller, a 23-year-old rookie fresh out of the academy. The name similarity was coincidental, no relation, just an unfortunate quirk of Oak Creek's hiring patterns. But where Bradley was hardened, Thomas was still soft with idealism. He still believed the job was about helping people. He still thought police work meant saving cats from trees and running toward danger to protect the innocent. Thomas was sweating. He had been sweating for the past 20 minutes, ever since Bradley had begun his daily monologue about the necessity of establishing dominance in the community. "You see," Miller Bradley said. His voice was a gravelly rasp. "It is about establishing the baseline. These people come into our town. They think they can just loiter, bring down the property values, act like they own the place. You give them an inch, they take a mile. You have to show them who holds the leash. You have to make them understand that there are rules. And those rules are enforced by people like us." Thomas had asked quietly. "Who? Who exactly do you mean?" And Bradley had looked at him with contempt. "Don't play dumb kid. You know exactly what I'm talking about. The element. The ones who don't belong here. You can spot them a mile away. They don't respect the law until you make them respect it. You have to use the tools at your disposal. Your presence, your authority, your judgment. Sometimes they need to feel consequences even if they haven't technically broken a law. That's how you prevent real crime." Thomas had said nothing. He had continued staring out the window, uncomfortably aware that what Bradley was describing was not police work. It was profiling. It was discrimination. But he was a rookie. And Bradley had been doing this for 6 years. Who was Thomas to question his training officer? What Thomas didn't know was that Bradley Miller had a personnel file that read like a masterclass in borderline misconduct. 14 excessive force complaints in 6 years, 9 of them involving minorities. All of them mysteriously dismissed or settled quietly by a union that protected its own. A union that had become expert at enabling rather than disciplining. Chief Robert Harrison was the department's commanding officer, an old-school lawman who still believed in the idea of the badge meaning something. He had tried repeatedly to find the smoking gun, the evidence that would allow him to strip Miller of his badge, to get him off the streets before he seriously hurt someone. But Miller was cunning in ways that went beyond just being aggressive. He knew where the camera blind spots were in the precinct. He knew how to write a report that twisted a victim's resistance into aggression, their fear into a threat. He had survived on technicalities and a departmental culture that valued loyalty to officers over accountability to the public. Miller accelerated the cruiser past the speed limit. Just because he could. The power of doing something technically against the rules with impunity was intoxicating to him. "Watch and learn, Miller," he said to Thomas. "Today you're going to see how real police work gets done. No more of that textbook garbage they fed you at the academy." Back at Arthurs Brew, Jamal was deep into the causes and consequences of the American Civil War. His mind was engaged with the historical complexity. When something unfortunate happened, the canvas bag on his lap shifted, reusable, the kind environmentally conscious people carried. Inside it, nestled carefully, was a jar of expensive artisanal honey. He had bought it himself as a small treat, something he could enjoy over the next few weeks, something that represented a moment of self-care in the midst of his demanding schedule. The jar rolled out of the bag. It fell to the pavement with a sudden terrible sound. Glass shattering, honey spreading across the white lines of the crosswalk in thick golden rivers. The jar had been substantial, expensive, and now it was gone. Jamal sighed, a sound of mild annoyance mixed with resignation. He looked at the mess, at the thick glass shards scattered across the intersection. He didn't panic. He stopped his wheelchair and put it in park. Carefully, mindfully. He leaned forward to assess the situation. He understood that these glass shards were a hazard. A car could blow a tire on them. Someone could step on them and be injured. He reached into his side pouch to grab a small cleaning rag, intending to push the larger pieces toward the gutter, where they wouldn't cause harm. He was focused on this small act of responsibility when he heard it. The roaring engine of a police cruiser turning onto 4th Avenue, the sound of an engine being pushed hard, tires meeting asphalt with aggression. Officer Bradley Miller was at the wheel, and he was already agitated about something. He was always agitated about something. Miller slammed on the brakes. The cruiser lurched to a stop, tires squealing in protest, the heavy vehicle shuddering to a halt merely 10 feet from Jamal's wheelchair. The sudden violent stop jolted Thomas against the dashboard. "What is this idiot doing?" Miller snarled, his face flushing with anger that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. He slammed his hand against the steering wheel horn, letting out a prolonged, deafening blast. That shattered the peaceful afternoon atmosphere of the street. Jamal flinched at the sound. But he didn't panic. He straightened his posture slowly, deliberately, turning his head to look at the cruiser over his shoulder. He raised one hand in a calm, apologetic gesture, pointing down at the shattered glass and the spilled honey, clearly signaling that he was temporarily delayed. To anyone observing with reasonable judgment, the situation was obvious and benign. A young man in a wheelchair had dropped something, and was doing the responsible thing by attempting to clear the hazard before moving on. To Officer Bradley Miller, it was an egregious act of defiance. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," Miller growled, his hands already moving to his seatbelt with violent speed. "Look at this guy. Thinks he owns the damn street. Probably intoxicated or looking for a lawsuit payout." "Sir," Thomas began, his voice trembling slightly. "He is in a wheelchair. It looks like he dropped something." "Shut up, Miller," Bradley snapped, his focus already moving toward confrontation. "I am handling this." He kicked the cruiser door open and stormed out into the afternoon heat, his hand instinctively resting on the butt of his service weapon. It was an intimidation tactic he used as naturally as breathing, the kind of automatic gesture that revealed his true understanding of what the gun meant. Power, dominance, fear. Jamal watched the officer approach through the rearview mirror attached to his wheelchair handle. He noted everything: the aggressive wide-legged stride, the flushed complexion, the flared nostrils. At 17, Jamal had learned things about human behavior. He had studied criminal psychology. He recognized instantly what Miller was: a man high on his own artificial authority, someone whose internal sense of power was fragile enough that the slightest perceived disrespect would trigger escalation. The shadow of Miller's body fell across Jamal's textbook. As the officer approached, Jamal looked up, blinking away his academic focus, and found himself staring directly at the brass buttons of a police uniform. His heart immediately began to beat faster, not from anything he had done, but from an awareness he had carried his entire life. The awareness that police interactions could go wrong, could escalate, could spiral into situations that were genuinely dangerous. He took a breath. He kept his hands visible on the table, exactly where Miller could see them. He spoke clearly, as he had been taught since childhood. "Can I help you, officer?" His voice was respectful, calm, and beneath the calmness was a carefully controlled fear. He had been taught this script since he was small. Keep your hands visible, speak clearly, do not argue, comply unless your safety is directly threatened. "What are you doing here?" Miller asked, his voice a low gravelly rumble designed to intimidate. His posture was confrontational, his shoulders squared, his stance wide. He was establishing dominance before he even knew if there was anything to dominate. Jamal gestured to the mountain of flashcards and the thick textbook spread before him. I am studying for my AP history exam, he said. He kept his tone neutral. Informative, not defensive. Studying. Miller repeated the word as though it were absurd, dripping with blatant skepticism. His eyes darted around the table, looking for any excuse, any minor infraction, something that would justify the building aggression he felt. You have been sitting here a long time. This place is for paying customers, not for kids to loiter and case the joint. Jamal felt a cold spike of adrenaline hit his chest. He forced himself to breathe, to stay calm, even as his body responded to threat. With the ancient patterns evolution had encoded into human biology. I am a paying customer, sir. I bought a hot chocolate about 30 minutes ago. He pointed to the mug and the receipt sitting right next to it. Physical evidence of his legitimate presence. Miller did not even glance at the receipt. He did not want to. The evidence would not matter because his mind was already made up. 30 minutes on a $5 drink does not buy you a permanent lease on the booth. Where do you live? I live in the city over in the West District. Jamal answered honestly, providing information, cooperating, doing exactly what he had been trained to do. The West District. Miller scoffed, a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. That's a long way from Oak Creek. You take the bus all the way out here just to read a book. I go to Oak Creek High, Jamal explained, keeping his hands flat on the table where Miller could see them. I am in the magnet program. I get out at 3 o'clock, and I am just waiting here for my mom to pick me up. Right? Waiting for your mom, Miller said, his tone entirely dismissive. The volume of his voice had risen just enough that the surrounding tables had gone completely silent. The businessman with the laptop was staring openly. The women from the book club were whispering behind their hands. Emily, the barista, was watching from the counter, her eyes wide with helpless anxiety. She knew Jamal. He came in twice a week. She wanted to say something to vouch for him, but the imposing presence of the officer froze the words in her throat. This was the thing about power worn like a weapon. It silenced not just the threatened person, but also the witnesses. It made good people afraid to speak up. I need to see some ID, Miller demanded, stepping closer, invading Jamal's personal space with a deliberateness that communicated threat. Jamal's heart hammered against his ribs. I do not have my wallet on me, officer. I left it in my mom's car this morning because I was rushing to make the bus. I only have my phone and my school ID. School ID is not valid government identification, Miller said flatly. He reached slowly toward his backpack to get his school lanyard. But Miller's hand shot out, slamming flat onto the table, rattling the coffee mug. Keep your hands where I can see them, Miller barked, instantly escalating the situation beyond any reasonable justification. You do not reach for anything unless I tell you to. Jamal froze, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. I was just getting my school ID like you asked. You do not have state-issued identification. You are loitering in a private business, and you are getting defensive. Miller listed off, twisting the reality of the situation into a neat, justifiable package for his own prejudice. Stand up. Now, officer, please, Jamal said, his voice trembling slightly despite his best efforts to hold it together. I have not done anything wrong. You can ask the barista. She knows me. My mom is going to be here any minute. I said stand up, Miller commanded, his voice now a booming shout that shattered the peaceful atmosphere of Arthur's Brew. The soft jazz became almost mockingly incongruous with the tension now filling the space. Reluctantly, terrified of what would happen if he disobeyed, Jamal slid out of this booth and stood up. He was tall, athletic from track, but in front of the aggressive, heavily armed officer, he felt incredibly small, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with physical size, and everything to do with the power imbalance between them. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Miller ordered, unhooking the metal handcuffs from his belt. The sharp clink-clink of the steel rings sounded deafening in the quiet café. "Wait. What? Are you arresting me?" Jamal's voice finally cracked with panic. "For what?" "For studying, for trespassing, loitering, and failing to identify yourself to a law enforcement officer," Miller sneered, grabbing Jamal's left wrist with brutal force and twisting it behind the teenager's back. A collective gasp rippled through the café. The businessman half stood up from his chair. "Hey, officer," the man called out nervously. "Is that really necessary?" He was just studying, but Miller was already moving past any point where reason could reach him. He was high on the power, drunk on the authority, lost in the justification of his own prejudice. The metal handcuffs clicked shut around Jamal's wrists. Not gently, but with enough force to cause discomfort. Arthur Pendleton, the businessman who had called out, had kept his phone recording the entire time. At first, he had told himself it was just insurance, documentation, proof of what he was witnessing, but something had shifted in him as he watched an officer violently restrain a teenager for the crime of studying. He slipped the phone under the edge of his table, angling it upward, capturing the entire interaction with crystal clarity. Emily, the barista, looked like she might cry. She wanted to do something, to say something. But what could she do? She was just a college student working a shift. Miller was reading Jamal his rights now, the words coming out mechanical and practiced, the ritual of authority. But his hand was still on Jamal's arm, still gripping, still communicating dominance. What Miller did not know was that in approximately 15 minutes, the woman who would come to pick up that boy would walk through the doors of the Oak Creek police station. That woman would be Captain Angela Hayes, the newly appointed commanding officer of the entire Oak Creek Police Department, the first woman to ever hold that rank in the precinct's history. He did not know that his worst nightmare was already on her way. The holding cell was cold and impersonal, a concrete box with a metal bench bolted to the wall, and a stainless steel toilet in the corner. Jamal sat on that bench, his hands still trembling, the marks from the handcuffs red and angry around his wrists. He kept replaying the moment the cuffs had clicked shut, over and over, unable to stop the loop of fear and confusion playing through his mind. An officer had taken him through the booking process. Name, date of birth, address. They had taken his phone. They had taken his shoelaces. They had asked if he wanted to call someone, and he had given them his mother's number. He did not expect her to answer. She was in a meeting. Important work meetings that she could not just leave. But a dispatcher had called the number and gotten transferred to her cell phone anyway. Captain Angela Hayes was in the middle of a budget meeting with the district commissioner. When her phone buzzed, she ignored it at first. Professional courtesy dictated that you did not check your phone during important meetings, but it buzzed again and again, finally excusing herself with a brief apology. She stepped out of the conference room and answered. "Ma'am, we have your son in custody. You are listed as his emergency contact." The words seemed to slow time. Everything else, the budget, the revenue projections, the departmental concerns, all of it evaporated in an instant. "For what?" she asked, her voice sharp, her cop's mind already running through scenarios. What did he do? Trespassing and loitering in a business, failing to identify himself to a police officer. Angela's jaw clenched. He is a student at Oak Creek High in the magnet program. He has a 4.0 GPA and a full scholarship package to Georgetown. He does not loiter. He studies. I am just calling to inform you of the detention. Booking is still in progress. Angela ended the call and grabbed her keys. The drive from downtown to the police station was normally 15 minutes. She made it in 9. running 2 lights, hitting speeds that would have gotten anyone else pulled over. She had no idea what had happened, but she knew her son. She knew that if he was in custody, something had gone very wrong. All the way there, she kept seeing his face. Him, at 5 years old, asking if he was really supposed to call her captain at school. Him at 12, understanding for the first time that his brown skin made some people nervous around her uniform. Him at 14, asking carefully constructed questions about his rights, demonstrating that he had already begun to understand the world he inhabited. And now her son was in handcuffs, in a police station, in the one place she had promised to protect him from. She parked in a no-parking zone and headed inside, not bothering with the niceties of proper parking. She was beyond courtesy now. At the front desk, she did not explain who she was. She simply said, "I am here to pick up Jamal Hayes. He was brought in approximately 30 minutes ago." The officer behind the desk looked up. His face went pale. "Captain Hayes." "Yes, ma'am. Right away. I will get Officer Miller." He processed the arrest. Angela nodded, her expression neutral, but inside something had shifted. The anger was cold now. Professional, dangerous, the kind of anger that came with authority, and the knowledge of exactly how to wield it. When Jamal heard his mother's voice at the front desk, sharp and authoritative, he felt something break inside his chest. Not from fear anymore, from shame. How was he going to explain this to her? What could he possibly say? That he was just studying. She already knew that the officer was wrong. She knew that too, probably better than anyone. He had spent his entire life being careful, being perfect, being worthy of the opportunities his mother had fought to give him. And it had not mattered. A man with a badge had decided it did not matter. A man with a gun and the power of the law had decided that Jamal's explanations, his cooperation, his obvious innocence meant nothing. And now his mother, the new captain of police, was about to walk through the door and see her son in handcuffs, in a police station, in the very place she had promised to protect him from being harassed. Officer Miller was reading through paperwork when Captain Hayes appeared at the interrogation room door. She was still in her business suit, but she had put on her dress uniform jacket, the one with her captain insignia prominently displayed on the shoulders, the insignia that communicated rank, authority, power. Her presence seemed to swallow the oxygen in the room. Officer Miller looked up. His face flushed pale, then red. "Captain," he said, standing up. "Ma'am, Where is my son?" Angela Hayes said quietly. Not a question, a command. The moment Captain Angela Hayes walked through the interrogation room door, the entire dynamic shifted. Miller felt it instantly. The way the room seemed to reorganize itself around her presence. The way every officer in proximity suddenly became hyper-aware of protocol, of procedure, of the fact that she was in the room. Jamal saw his mother, and for the first time since the handcuffs had clicked shut, he felt like he could breathe. Not because the situation was resolved, but because his mother was here, and his mother was powerful in ways that Officer Miller was only beginning to understand. Angela's eyes found her son's immediately. Her jaw tightened when she saw the red marks around his wrists, where the handcuffs had been. Those marks would become important later, evidence of force, physical proof of what had happened. But for now her expression remained controlled, professional, a captain addressing an officer, not a mother assessing the damage to her child. "Officer Miller," she said, her voice carrying the particular tone of command that came with rank. "Release my son, now!" "Captain Hayes," Miller began, trying to explain, trying to justify. But Angela raised one hand. "I am not interested in whatever explanation you have," she said calmly. "I want you to understand something, and I want you to understand it very clearly. My son was lawfully present in a café. He was a paying customer. He was studying for an important exam. He was doing absolutely nothing wrong. And you placed him in handcuffs based on profiling, based on bias, based on the color of his skin. Miller's face had gone from red to nearly purple. Ma'am, with respect, he did not have valid identification. Angela interrupted. He has a student ID from Oak Creek High where he attends. In the magnet program, with a 4.0 GPA, you have detained a teenager, handcuffed him violently, and arrested him for studying in a public place while black. Do you understand what you have done? The room had gone completely silent. Officers who had been going about their business had stopped. Everyone in the precinct understood what was happening. A captain was addressing an officer's misconduct, and it was being done with an audience. Miller tried again. We received a report. No, you did not, Angela said, her voice like ice. You received nothing. You saw my son in a cafe and decided based on your prejudices that he did not belong. You invented probable cause, you violated his rights, and you are going to live with that decision. She turned to the desk sergeant. Release him. Remove the charges, and get the body cam footage from Officer Miller's shift, all of it. Captain, there are procedures. Miller started, but Angela stepped closer to him, and her proximity communicated something that his brain understood, even if his mouth wanted to argue. You want to talk about procedures? She asked softly. Let me explain procedures to you. There is a procedure for accountability. There's a procedure for investigation. There's a procedure for officers who abuse their authority. You are about to learn all of them very intimately, Officer Miller. She turned away from him and walked to her son. Jamal saw her coming, and suddenly all the fear, all the shame, all the confusion of the past 30 minutes came pouring out of him. Angela pulled him into an embrace, and Jamal finally let himself break. I have got you, she whispered into his hair, her voice shifting from captain to mother. I have got you. He is never going to touch you again. But as she held her son, Angela's mind was already moving ahead, already calculating, already planning. She had been a police officer for 20 years. She knew how departments worked. She knew how complaints were buried. She knew how officers protected their own. She knew that one captain alone could not change a culture of corruption. But she was going to make damn sure that Officer Miller paid a price, so steep that others would think twice before doing what he had done. The moment Miller had placed his hands on Jamal in that cafe, he had made a mistake that would define the rest of his life. He just did not know it yet. By the time Angela walked out of the police station with her son, she had already made her calls. The first call was to Detective William Keller, the internal affairs investigator known throughout the department for being ruthless in pursuing corruption. Keller was the kind of investigator who did not play politics, who did not cut deals with the union, who believed that accountability meant something. Keller, she said without preamble when he answered. I need a comprehensive retroactive audit. Officer Bradley Miller. Every arrest, every detention, every civilian complaint filed against him over his entire 6-year career. I am requesting it formally, and I am bypassing the union. Captain Hayes, Keller said, and she could hear the understanding in his voice. He had been waiting for something like this. I can have preliminary findings by tomorrow. The second call was to the Washington Post. She did not give them details. She would not yet. But she gave them a heads up that a story was coming, a story about a police officer, about profiling, about a teenager. The third call was to a civil rights attorney named Charles Kensington, someone she knew from community boards, someone with a reputation for taking on police departments and winning. "I need representation for my son," she said, "and potentially for other victims." By the next morning, when Detective Keller opened the files on Officer Bradley Miller, what he found was staggering. 14 complaints across 6 years, 9 involving minorities. A pattern so clear, so obvious, that it could not possibly be accidental. Racial profiling, excessive use of force, unlawful detentions, and what was more damning, documentation that showed previous commanding officers had been quietly burying these complaints, settling them out of court, keeping them off the official record, to maintain the precinct statistics. Within 2 weeks, encouraged by the viral video that had been uploaded to social media, Arthur Pendleton's footage of the café confrontation had exploded online, amassing 4 million views by morning and hitting national news by noon. Previous victims began coming forward. A delivery driver named Leo Gibson testified that Miller had detained him for an hour without any legitimate cause, simply because Gibson matched some vague description Miller had invented. A local mechanic produced dashcam footage of Miller planting an open container in his vehicle, manufacturing evidence to justify a search that had no legal basis. A woman named Sarah Chen described being stopped 4 times in 3 months, each time being asked to step out of her vehicle, each time the interaction escalating, in ways that seemed to have nothing to do with her driving. The Oak Creek Police Department was facing a massive civil rights scandal, and Mayor Gregory Harrison, desperate to save his own political career, threw Miller to the wolves. There would be no protection, no union loyalty, no brotherhood of the badge covering for this officer. Miller had become too toxic, too public, too visible. The decision was made quickly. Terminate Officer Miller's employment within a month. But that was only the beginning. The courthouse was packed on the day of the trial. News cameras lined the exterior. Civil rights organizations showed up to support Jamal and the other victims. The community showed up because this was their community. These were their streets, and what happened to Jamal could happen to any of them. District Attorney Rebecca Montgomery, facing intense public pressure and understanding the political advantages of justice, had pursued the case aggressively. Bradley Miller was indicted on 2 counts of false imprisonment, 1 count of battery, and 3 counts of official oppression under the color of law. The trial was relatively brief. The evidence was overwhelming. Arthur Pendleton took the stand and described what he had witnessed, what he had captured on his phone. 7 minutes of video evidence. The moment Miller had approached Jamal. The moment Jamal had calmly explained his presence. The moment Miller had fabricated probable cause. The moment the handcuffs had come out. Emily, the barista, took the stand and testified that Jamal was a regular customer, a conscientious student, someone she had never seen cause any disturbance. And then Jamal took the stand. He was articulate and poised, his voice steady as he described the moment of confrontation, the fear he had felt, the way Officer Miller had dismissed every explanation, every piece of evidence of his innocence. He did not want to understand, Jamal said, looking directly at the jury. He had already decided who I was, and nothing I said mattered because it did not fit the story he had already created in his mind. Miller's defense attorney tried to argue that his client was merely overzealous, that he had been trying to maintain order, that the detaining of Jamal was a judgment call that went slightly wrong. But when the prosecution played the video of Miller after confronted by Captain Hayes admitting to her that he had no probable cause, his own words on camera, his own admission, the jury's faces hardened into stone. It took them less than 4 hours to return a guilty verdict on all counts. When the judge handed down the sentence, his words were not delivered gently. "Mr. Miller, you were given a badge and a gun to protect the public. Instead, you used them as tools of intimidation to enforce your own prejudice, You violated the rights of a young person who was doing nothing more than studying for an examination. You abused the authority granted to you. And in doing so, you betrayed the trust of every person in this community. You are a disgrace to the uniform and a danger to civil society. Bradley Miller was sentenced to 36 months in a state correctional facility, but the financial ruin was only beginning. Because Officer Miller had been convicted of felonies, the city immediately moved to revoke his pension. His shield was stripped. His authority was erased. The civil rights attorneys moved swiftly, filing a massive class action lawsuit against Miller and the city, on behalf of Jamal and the other victims who had been identified during the investigation. Miller facing the lawsuit alone, with no union protection, with no departmental support, watched as his life collapsed. His house in the suburbs was sold to cover legal bills. His savings evaporated into fees. The settlement amount the judge awarded to Jamal and the other victims was substantial. Money meant to acknowledge harm, to provide restitution, to communicate that what had happened mattered, and that there would be consequences. By year 2 of his sentence, Bradley Miller sat in his cell. Protective segregation meant 23 hours alone in a small concrete room, and finally began to understand what he had done. The prison had provided him with the court documents. He read them repeatedly, unable to stop himself from reading the phrase that appeared again and again, pattern of racial profiling. Like he was part of a machine, like he was not making individual choices but following a designed pattern. But that was not how he had seen it at the time. He had thought he was doing his job, keeping order, maintaining boundaries, establishing who belonged and who did not. Except the documents had footage. His own body camera footage. Footage of him fabricating probable cause. Footage of him ignoring Jamal's explanations. Footage of him reaching for an excuse instead of reaching for truth. He watched that café footage so many times in his mind. In the darkness of his cell, during the endless hours of isolation, that he could see every moment with perfect clarity. The kid's calm face, the mother's uniform, the moment his power had shattered, and Miller finally understood. The world he had believed in, the order he had been protecting. It was not justice, it was just power. Power he had used to hurt people who could not fight back, until one could, until one's mother could. He thought about that moment constantly, the moment the captain had walked in, the moment he realized he was powerless, the moment he finally understood what it felt like, the same way a kid studying for an exam would have felt. Except Jamal had done nothing wrong. Miller had. 3 years later, Bradley Miller was released. He was 42 years old, a convicted felon, bankrupt, and nationally infamous. His face had been on the news. His name had been in the papers. His story had become a cautionary tale about what happens when power is abused. No security firm would hire him. His background check was permanently damaged. No police department would even let him into their lobby, let alone employ him. He ended up working the graveyard shift at a rural scrap metal yard, sitting alone in a freezing toll booth, jumping at shadows, a hollow echo of the man he had been. But by that same time, 3 years later, Jamal Hayes had completed something entirely different with his life. The incident at the café never derailed Jamal's focus. If anything, it sharpened it. For 2 months after the arrest, Jamal could not walk into Arthur's Brew without his hands shaking. He would sit in his room replaying that moment, when the handcuffs had clicked shut, when he thought his life was over, when he realized that being innocent was not enough protection against arbitrary power. His mother found him one evening, sitting in the dark of his bedroom. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, sitting down beside him. "I am thinking about how I did everything right," he said quietly. And it did not matter. Angela took his hand. "You did do everything right. But that officer made a choice that was about him, not about you. his racism, his insecurity, his need to prove power. That had nothing to do with you, or anything you did. But he had a gun, Jamal said, and a badge, and the law. Yes, Angela said, and that is exactly why this matters. That is exactly why we fought back. Because if we do not fight back, men like him think they can keep doing it. To you, to the next person, to everyone. Jamal looked at his mother in her dress uniform, at the insignia on her shoulder that communicated rank and authority. I want to change the system, he said quietly. I do not want to just survive it. I want to change it. Something shifted in him that night. The shame did not disappear, but it transformed. It became purpose. 3 weeks later, when his AP exam came around, he scored a 97. Georgetown sent his acceptance letter in May. It was full scholarship, the kind of opportunity that represented possibility, potential, a future that was genuinely open. The substantial settlement money from the civil suit was placed in a trust. Jamal would never have to take out a single student loan. The financial barriers that might have derailed his trajectory were removed, not as a gift, but as recognition that he had been wronged, and that there needed to be restitution. He maintained his 4.0 GPA throughout high school. He won his events in track. He became the kind of student that universities looked at and thought, this person is going to change the world. 4 years later, in May of 2026, Jamal Hayes walked across the stage at Georgetown University. He was graduating summa cum laude, with a degree in pre-law. The speech was given in Washington, D.C., the capital of the country, the place where laws were written, and power was exercised, and justice was debated. Sitting in the front row wearing her dress uniform, and weeping with pride, was Oak Creek's newly promoted chief of police, Angela Hayes. She had been promoted because she had followed through on her promises, because she had demanded accountability, because she had shown the community that corruption had consequences, and that officers who abused their authority would be held responsible. And there in that moment was the fullness of what had been accomplished. An officer had abused his power. A mother had held him accountable. A system had, despite its resistance, despite its institutional inertia, finally responded to justice. Jamal had refused to accept the permanent damage that had been done to him. He had refused to let that moment define his future. Instead, he had transformed pain into purpose. I am heading to law school in the fall, he announced to his mother after the ceremony. I have decided I do not just want to know history. I want to be the one writing the laws, to make sure men like Bradley Miller never hold power again. Angela embraced her son, and in that embrace was everything. The fear she had felt when she had learned he was in custody, the rage she had felt when she had seen the marks on his wrists, the satisfaction she had felt when justice had been delivered, and the hope she felt now, looking at her son's future. Several months later, the same BP gas station where this story had begun in many ways. The place where Jamal and his mother had their rituals, their check-ins, their moments of connection, played a scene that would have been ordinary and unremarkable to everyone, except two people. Renee filled her tank. The attendant took her payment. She got back in her car. Jada, who was now 10 years old, sat in the passenger seat. She was growing up faster than Renee wanted, already aware of things that children should not have to be aware of, already understanding the world in ways. That required an extra layer of protection. A patrol car pulled into the lot. Different officers. Young, professional. The car pulled up to the pump 3 stalls over. The officer waved at Renee. Just a standard polite acknowledgement that you would encounter 100 times in a day. No threat. No escalation. just a human being waving at another human being. He kept driving. Jada watched him go. "Mommy, was that okay?" "Yeah, baby," Renee said. "That was just a police officer doing his job." Silence then. A silence that contained so much. "Is it safe now?" Jada asked. Renee paused. She could lie. She could make it simple. But Jada deserved truth. "It is safer," Renee said carefully. "We made it safer. But we have to keep watching. Because that is what justice actually looked like. Not a perfect ending. Not a world that was completely safe or completely just. But a world where one officer had been held accountable. Where a system had been forced to acknowledge its failures. Where a teenager had refused to be broken by what happened to him, and had instead transformed it into purpose. The outcomes were mixed and real and imperfect as real justice always is. Officer Bradley Miller was convicted. Criminal charges were pending the completion of his sentence. A plea deal negotiation might eventually reduce his time, or he might serve the full term. Captain Angela Hayes was promoted to chief. 3 other officers who had been implicated in Miller's pattern of violations were suspended. 2 resigned. 1 fought termination and lost. But the real change was Ordinance 2024-1118. Body cameras became mandatory for all officers. Footage was made public within 72 hours, with exceptions only for ongoing investigations. Quotas were banned. A civilian review board was established with subpoena power. Annual bias training became required. Complaints against officers could no longer be buried quietly. The system that had enabled Miller, that had protected him, that had allowed him to operate with impunity, was fundamentally restructured. Not perfect, but better. Much better. Jamal Hayes graduated from Georgetown University. He walked across that stage in his cap and gown, summa cum laude, pre-law degree in hand, knowing that the path in front of him was one he had chosen, because of what had happened, because of what his mother had taught him about accountability and responsibility. Law school was next. Harvard Law was considering him. Yale had already made an offer. The best institutions recognized his potential, his story, his determination. And as he began the next chapter of his life, the story that had started in a café, with a boy studying for an exam, with honey spilled on pavement, with an officer making a choice that would echo through time, that story was entering a new phase. Jamal Hayes would become a lawyer. He would work in civil rights. He would defend people against abuse of authority. He would spend his career trying to ensure that what happened to him did not happen to others. The pain had been real. The injustice had been real. But so was the possibility that had emerged from it. And every officer who heard the story of Bradley Miller, every officer who understood that accountability was no longer optional, who recognized that badges did not protect you from consequences anymore. They became part of the change too, not because they were converted by justice, but because they understood that the consequences were real, and that the system was finally beginning to enforce the accountability. That should have always been there. This is what accountability looks like. This is what justice looks like. Not perfect, not complete, but real and powerful and life-changing. The gas station is still there. The police still patrol. But now so do the cameras. And the people behind them. Watching. Documenting. Ensuring that what happened to Jamal Hayes will not be buried, will not be forgotten, and will not be repeated without consequence. If this story of justice and accountability meant something to you, share it. Not for the clicks. Share it because patterns only change when people refuse to look away. Your voice matters. Your refusal to accept injustice matters. The system will not change itself. It only changes when people demand it. when they refuse to accept the status quo, when they hold those in power accountable for their actions. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Stories about real people fighting real injustice. Stories about the moments when power finally crumbles and accountability finally arrives. Stories that remind us what is possible when we refuse to accept the unacceptable.